I'm very happy to have you, David. Thank you.
Well, great to be on your show, and congratulations on what you're doing and facilitating communication. I think we're probably going to be in an era of rapid evolution of psychotherapy now that we have people like you and wonderful technology to start getting ideas disseminated far more quickly. It's exciting to think about. We have a long way to go in our field, and hopefully we can start moving things in some exciting new directions.
For sure. I know that you're also starting already to put some of your measures and some of your work into the technology part, into the virtual world. So maybe we can talk also a little bit about that.
Sure.
But first of all, I'd like to touch on this topic that's almost inevitable, which is the self-help industry. And you've been a big part of that in a way, but with this interesting twist that you're a accredited psychotherapist. And
right, I'm actually a
a
psychiatrist.
psychiatrist, exactly.
People think I'm a psychologist
Because you
because
actually
I'm not, so much pushing meds. I started out as a full-time psychopharmacologist, but became much more attracted to the new and ongoing developments in psychotherapy.
Yeah. Well, I will ask you a little bit about that because I know, of course, our colleague Aaron Beck drove you a little bit in that direction or helped
Oh,
you
very much so,
in
yeah.
that direction.
Albert Ellis also.
Yes, and before jumping into that, I'd still like to ask you, the latest numbers we have, we know that new self-help books appear by the 2000 every year, and that about $600 million are spent each year in the America alone for self-help industry. And I'm very curious to ask you, does this worry you or enthusiasm you?
Well, I'm kind of indifferent to it, to be honest with you. If things like that upset me, I'd be upset all the time. But I never had intended Feeling Good to be a self-help book, by the way, and it was kind of an accident that it came to be viewed in that manner. But I was simply very excited. I was learning about cognitive therapy for the first time and seeing some pretty remarkable developments in people I'd been stuck with when I was using more traditional forms of treatment. And I just wanted to share these exciting developments with people. And my idea was that patients, I had originally thought I could get like 100 copies made kind of just as handouts for my patients. I wasn't thinking of it as a book or a self-help book. And because there's a lot in the new forms of psychotherapy of learning involved for the patient, like about the 10 cognitive distortions and self-defeating beliefs like the achievement addiction, the love addiction, approval addiction, entitlement, all of these kinds of things, that patients could read between sessions to accelerate the treatment so that when I met with them, I would individualize it, do the part that maybe couldn't be represented in a handout or a book. And then when Forrest Kogan, a clinical psychologist, a research psychologist from the University of Alabama, began to think of the book as a self-help book, and he wanted to see if it had any actual antidepressant properties. And so he did a series of outcome studies that you may be familiar with, and some of the listeners may not, but he took patients coming to the University of Alabama Medical Center seeking treatment for depression, and he told them it'll be 4 weeks before you can meet with your psychiatrist or psychologist for medication or psychotherapy. But in the meanwhile, here's a book that you can read. And then they studied these people over the 4 weeks, and they discovered that 2/3 of them had improved so much in those 4 weeks that they no longer wanted or needed treatment. And then he replicated that. He repeated the experiment with a control group who got a placebo book to see it was just a placebo effect. They did long-term follow-up studies. And I first read about those studies in the New York Times. I didn't even know the studies were going on. And so it was a pleasant pleasant shock to the system, and made me aware that for at least many people, just reading something, if it has good information in it, can have significant antidepressant effects, maybe as good as or even better than antidepressant drugs or psychotherapy. But some people are definitely going to need a face-to-face therapy. But I think it's encouraging that a lot of folks can be helped on their own. But as far as self-help books, to me they turn me off tremendously. The tone is kind of narcissistic, and everybody wants to write a book, and that they're just. I find that whole concept somewhat irritating. To be honest, although I totally support getting tools in the hands of the public that can help people if they can't afford therapy, or even if they can afford therapy, there may be not competent, skillful, effective therapists in their area. So, I'm all for the general concept.
Yeah. What you're saying connects with, it reminded me, I remember John Norcross, when he edited a book on the authoritative guide of self-help books, that he found out that about 95% had no scientific evidence behind them. So is this part of your concern also?
Yeah, it's just somebody wants to write a book. Every day I get in the emails from several people saying, "Oh, I'm going to write a book about my depression, or I have a self-help book or self-help book, well, on this or that, and will you endorse it and that type of thing." And I was just fortunate that Feeling Good has done so well, and I think the reason for it is because I've had many patients. I used to, when I was starting out in practice, I used to see 70 patients a week for full psychotherapy sessions. And I had very challenging kinds of patients. Almost, over a quarter of them had a borderline personality disorder. And I saw very clearly early on what worked and what didn't work, what was really effective for people. And a lot of things that I thought sounded good on paper in my head just actually were worthless. And the reason I knew that is I was using the Beck Depression Inventory with every patient at every session, so I could see with ultimate certainty whether they were improving or not improving, and how much they were improving. And so that's what really kind of led to Feeling Good, is to let's put together those things that are really working for people. One of the things in the book that's been the most helpful for patients has been my list of 10 cognitive distortions. Beck had about 4 cognitive distortions, and they had kind of big names like selective negative focus, or technical sounding names, and I gave them simple names and added a bunch more. And then one day I was treating this man, really a nice fellow, and he was depressed. I was explaining about all or nothing thinking and overgeneralization and should statements, and all of jumping to conclusions and all of this type of thing. And he said, "Why don't you make a list of these?" And you could hand the list to your patients, and then it would make it easier for us to see the distortions in our negative thoughts. And I thought, wow, what a cool and obvious idea that is. And I went home that night and put together this list of 10 cognitive distortions and started handing it out to patients the next day. And they really liked it. And it was that type of thing that I said, boy, why don't I put these together in some kind of format that I could, photocopy or reproduce in some way, and give a little package of these tools to my patients. And then ultimately that turned into the book Feeling Good.
Well, cognitive therapy owes you a big debt in a way, because it was practically unknown when you published the book. And shortly afterwards, I think, 7 years afterwards, it became a boom, right? And your book helped a lot to widespread cognitive therapy.
Yes, that's exactly right. When I started out going to Beck's weekly seminar, when I was a postdoctoral fellow in psychiatry at the medical school at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, there were only maybe 10 of us in the world who had gone to his seminar or knew something about cognitive therapy. And in the early days, he and I would give occasional presentation to a professional group, or we would give a talk to the psychiatric residents at Penn, and people were like kind of like throwing stones at us type of thing, like, intellectually speaking, like, what is this goofy new thing, and this doesn't sound superficial, and psychoanalysis is the pure gold, and they weren't that taken by it, and then after Feeling Good came out, it started to become really well recognized. And in 1988, which was 8 years after Feeling Good was released, it suddenly went to the top of all the bestseller lists in the United States, and now it's gone worldwide. And now I think that cognitive therapy is probably one of the most widely used forms of psychotherapy in the world, if not the number one, and also the most researched. And now the paradox is, now I've moved beyond cognitive therapy, although I still use cognitive therapy techniques. Now I have something new that's even more powerful. It captures all the good features of cognitive therapy and addresses the limitations in cognitive therapy as well as other forms of psychotherapy. And so now I'm kind of out in the woods again, an unknown, saying, hey, there's some new terrific thing. I'm trying to get people excited about it. And I hope history will repeat itself, because the new developments have a tremendous amount to offer therapists and individuals who are suffering as well.
And we are for sure going to talk about that. Also, actually, you are, of course, talking about team therapy, the new model that you developed. I would also recommend a lot of people hearing your new podcast on the topic, because
Thank you.
It's really great, and anyone can really start to get a handle of your new ideas through that. And before jumping
that's just by way of commercial message. Since they're free, I can probably get away with promoting them. But you can listen to the podcasts on my website, feelinggood.com. And we've recorded about 20 so far, and we'll be publishing one or two a week. Also, if you have iTunes, you can listen to them on free of charge on iTunes. And if anybody is willing to listen to them and give us a review and a rating, that will help us, because if your ratings go high enough in iTunes, then you get a more prominent position, I guess, in their iTunes store or whatever. That's very helpful. But the podcasts are intended for therapists and for the patients and for the general public to talk about the old and the new developments.
And like you're saying, you built a lot on cognitive therapy, and the interesting thing is, we don't really need, even in our interview, I don't need to introduce cognitive therapy, because most people already know the basic model. But still, I'd like to ask you then about Aaron Beck, the person. What are your fond memories of the man, and how did he inspire you?
Well, one of the things that I first went to his seminar just to prove to myself that it was baloney, because our department chairman said, "Hey, there's something new for you to explore. This guy Beck has this idea that depression is due to negative thoughts, and you can train patients to think, more positively, more realistically." And he sees that as the cause and treatment for depression. And I thought, oh boy, I was doing brain research and psychopharmacology, and I knew my patients had negative thoughts, but I wasn't convinced that they could, you could have them change their negative thoughts and they'd feel better. It just seems silly. Like there was this guy, Norman Vincent Peale, he had a book, The Power of Positive Thinking, that was huge, I think, in the 1930s. And it sounded like that to me, kind of like a silly thing. And so I started going to his weekly seminars, and there would be like maybe 7 or 8 of us. We met in an old room at this state mental hospital that was next to the university, and not too many people were interested. And at the start of the seminar, he'd say, "Does anyone have any case that we need to address today?" And then I would describe someone who was actively suicidal, who I had gotten permission to present their case in the seminar. And I said, so-and-so has told me that if I can't come up with something good to help them today, they're going to commit suicide tonight. And then he would say, "Oh, let's take Dr. Burns' case first." And that way I got a lot of attention. I did that at the start of every seminar. The other people were afraid to present their cases because they were afraid, they'd be seen as, inept. Well, I knew I was inept, so I would just present all these patients I was stuck with. And then he would say, "Well, why don't you try this? And why don't you try that?" Mm-hmm. And then I would go back and try the suggestion. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, the patient would say, "This is really helping me. Do you have some more of these techniques?" And I'd say, "Yeah, but you have to wait another week. I'm trying to learn one new technique every week. And I've used all the ones I have so far, but next week I'll show you another new technique." And it was really the patients who I was treating who got me hooked on cognitive therapy. And I think one of Beck had a couple real strong contributions that he made and skills that he had. And one of them was he was just a very skillful consultant, a clever consultant to present a case and to come up with practical strategies to help that patient get unstuck. And that's one of the things I remember most fondly about him. And then also I liked his intellectual critical thinking. I went to college at Amherst in Massachusetts and got a liberal arts education. And one of the things that we learned, the main focus, I think, of a liberal arts education was to be a critical thinker, to challenge everything, not to take things on face value. And if you do that, you begin to see things very differently from other people. Mm-hmm. And he was like that. And so I found that our thinking was often very similar, and I respected that. I respected that as well. And I think his contributions to the history of psychotherapy, as well as those of his forerunner Albert Ellis in New York, were really very tremendous, getting us into the era of measuring things with his Beck Depression Inventory. And before that, people thought, well, depression is a mysterious thing, and no therapists weren't measuring anything. And to this day, most therapists aren't measuring things. But I think that measuring is incredibly important. I don't think you can do good psychotherapy without assessment and measurement at every session. And so those were some of his many contributions.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever get a chance to meet Albert Ellis?
Yes, I did.
Could you tell us that story?
I will. I was very fond of Ellis, although I didn't know him very well because I was more in the Beck camp, and there was some competition between the two. But I sent Albert Ellis a copy of Feeling Good for comments, and before it was released. Mm-hmm. And he was kind enough to write back to me and say, you're not mentioning me in this book at all. And I was 10 years ahead of Beck. And so I put an acknowledgement of his contribution. I didn't know anything about him at the time. But then I came to see that he had made tremendous contributions. He was eccentric in a way. I say that with affection. Anyone who's ever known him or seen him in a workshop knows that's true. He's kind of a wild man. Mm-hmm. But he made tremendous contributions. And I always sung his praises when I would give workshops around the U.S. and Canada. And I think, like so many gurus in our field, he was probably just a tad on the narcissistic side. And so word got back to him that there's this guy Burns who's in the Beck camp, but he's really an admirer of yours. And so he decided he liked me. And we had a number of interactions over the years that were all really delightful. And I just think the world of him, and his passing, I think, was a great loss. And I have always felt that he didn't get his share of recognition, although he was very well known and known around the world. But I think he contributed a lot. His therapeutic style was radically different from Beck's and also from my own. Mm-hmm. He was kind of into confronting patients with their irrational beliefs in a kind of aggressive and funny way, and some patients like that, and others were, greatly turned off by him. But he had one thing: tremendous integrity, which many of the gurus did not do, and to this day do not. And he never stole things from other people and took credit for them. And many of the gurus in our field, including those today, I believe, do take from other people and give it a slightly different name and call it their own thing. And Ellis never ever did that. He was always into the history of the people who came before him and the histories of these ideas and what's new and what he credited others with. And I tip my hat to him and always will be because of that.
There is one part of Ellis' work that, curiously enough, I think is a distinctive feature of his brand of cognitive therapy that's not very present in the Beck therapy, but that I've seen creeping up in your own work, and that's the part where he was against self-esteem. He was against ego.
Oh, yeah, right. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's one of my favorite topics. That's a Buddhist topic, by the way.
And I have to ask you, making that connection, I have to ask you, why do you think ego prevents us from being better therapists?
Well, because, and that's a huge topic maybe for a whole workshop, but the therapist ego causes a lot of therapeutic failure on many different levels. One of the things that I teach a lot in my workshops and I have free groups at Stanford for community therapists. They can come in once a week and have a 2.5-hour training in new psychotherapy techniques, and they can come if they want for the rest of their lives for no charge. They can get unlimited free therapy because we do therapy as part of the training groups I do at Stanford, and unlimited free training. But one of the things, just among others, is how do you handle patient criticisms? Because I have developed very sensitive empathy scale and helpfulness scale that patients have to complete in the waiting room after every session, along with other assessment tools. And these scales are so sensitive that initially, when community therapists use them, they're shocked to discover that they get failing grades from every patient at every session on every scale.
Yeah.
The patients are telling them, you really didn't understand me. I didn't really feel cared about. You're not really helping me with my problems. And this is painful for the therapist to see that. And then we do training exercises in my seminars and workshops, and one of the exercises I've developed is someone plays the role of a difficult patient, and then the other one plays the role of the therapist, and the difficult patient attacks the therapist with a statement like, "You're not helping me, you don't understand me, you probably don't even like me." Mm-hmm. And then the therapist has to respond with what I call the 5 secrets of effective communication. And one of those is called the disarming technique. And that's where you find the truth in what the patient is saying, even if it seems illogical or irrational or exaggerated or untrue. Mm-hmm. And this technique is based on what I call the law of opposites, and that's that if you defend yourself against a false criticism, you'll prove that the criticism is valid. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a paradox.
It's a paradoxical technique, yeah.
And on the other hand, if you agree with a criticism that seems totally false and not valid, the moment you agree with it, the patient won't believe it anymore, and we'll see that it's not true. Mm-hmm. But doing this involves the death of the patient's ego, and so the patient might, or the death of the therapist's ego.
Yeah.
But it's hard for therapists because patients are going to tell therapists something they don't want to hear. You see, when the patient tells you, "You don't understand me," mm-hmm. You're not helping me, that's striking right to the heart of the therapist's pride, because we take our pride is based that we think wrongly that we can understand people, that we have good empathy skills. And the winning response would be to say something to the patient along the lines, you know, you're right, Jim, I haven't been helpful to you, and I've had that feeling too, that I'm not getting you, I'm not understanding you at a deep level, and it's been painful for me as well. Tell me more about that. I can imagine maybe you're feeling angry and disappointed and a bit lonely and discouraged, maybe hopeless. This is important. Tell me about it. This is the conversation we need to have. We're really on the same page. And when the patient hears that, they just open right up and they say, "Oh, my therapist is okay after all. He's hearing what I have to say. He really does care. He really is open." But it's very difficult for therapists to learn how to do this because they don't want to agree with the patient who's saying you're no good. And yet what the patient is saying is true. When patients criticize therapists in this way, the criticism is always valid. The therapist is screwing up in just that way. So that would be one example of where, if you think you have a self, then you're going to find the criticism very painful because your self is being challenged. But if you have let your ego die, if you become at least temporarily enlightened, then you view this as an opportunity to learn. You see that you've made mistakes, you've made errors, but you don't have a self that's being challenged. And it's the same that's true in my teaching at Stanford, and in my workshops. I have the students evaluate me with extremely sensitive scales at the end of every supervision session, at the end of every seminar. And then I reflect back to them, here were your greatest criticisms of the seminar last week, and here's what you like the best. And I do that in workshops. The day 2 of a 2-day workshop, I read out loud, here's the 10 worst things that people said about me on the evaluation form at the end of day 1. And here are the things that you like the best. And the audiences, they just love that. When you open up, and they criticize me in all kinds of ways. And usually the criticisms are valid. And it's painful when I read them at night. And then when I read them to the workshop audience, they laugh. They just love it. They think it's wonderful. And they say, well, Dr. Burns is humble. He's a regular guy. And this allows us to connect at a deeper level. But I have to let my ego die in order to teach like that. And the same in a therapy session. I had a patient once told me, the therapy that you're doing with me is worse than the incest I endured as a child. And it was horribly painful for me, and I got so hurt and so angry. I didn't let on, and I didn't say much the rest of the session because I didn't want to blow it. And she was seated right next to her husband. I had the husband join the session because I knew she was very fragile. She had borderline personality disorder, and she was always enraged with people, and horrifically depressed. She'd had over a decade of failed therapy and antidepressants from various therapists. And then I was thinking about what she said. On the weekend, I was out jogging and on this little 4-mile path I used to go on, and I was thinking, how could I ever agree with her? It's so unfair. I've never had a patient I worked harder for than this individual. And then it occurred to me what she was trying to tell me. I saw the truth in it, and it was very painful for me. And when I saw her the next week, I said, Margaret, I'm, just disguising her identity. What you said to me last week was so painful, and I was enraged. I kind of wanted to kill you, to tell you the truth. It was, and because I've felt like I've given and given and given to you, and it's never enough. And I just felt, wrongly and unfairly blamed. And then on the weekend, I was jogging, and I was thinking about what you said and trying to understand it. And then it occurred to me probably what you meant, and it was painful to see how badly I've screwed up. And although I can't say I got it 100%, I think you're trying to tell me that I've been kind of trying to exploit you with all my fancy tools and techniques, rather than showing compassion for you, the human being, and the suffering that you've been through. And exploiting you much the ways that family members did when you were a little girl. And you were trying to tell me you wanted somebody to understand and to admit that the failure, and I saw how I failed you, and I felt such shame and sadness, and I can imagine how lonely and enraged you feel. At the same time, I was excited because this is the conversation we need to have to get on a deeper level and do the kind of work that you want, the kind of work that I want. And she was very warm. She was in her response, and she cried, and we connected on a deeper level. And she later told me, and she eventually recovered completely and got over her depression. And she later said that was the moment that changed her life, that when I agreed that I had failed her and was able to see the truth on what she was saying. But that involves the death of the therapist's ego. And none of us want to die. Once you're dead, it feels great as you've joined the Grateful Dead because you have nothing to lose anymore, and you can get close to people, and you're not fearful of criticism. But most therapists have egos and pride, and it's hard to learn some of these new techniques because they ask the therapist to dig far more deeply.
Yeah. Just to make explicit, because you are putting there a process that's not common in cognitive therapy, traditional cognitive therapy, which is this non-defensive attitude actually melts resistance.
Yes, right. And we have many other radically new techniques. This one's been around, I developed this type of training in the late 1980s. So in my training groups, we've used this type of thing to enhance therapeutic empathy. But we have now other even bigger breakthroughs in that have emerged from my weekly training groups at Stanford.
It's so interesting that some of your developments come from your own findings and findings of other researchers like Michael Lambert, that it seems that therapists are just overconfident a lot of the times.
Yes. One of the things that I often say in my workshops, I often show some of the assessment tools we use. And we have patients actually rate their mood, their depression severity, before each session. They do it in the waiting room. How are you feeling right now? How depressed, how suicidal, how angry, how anxious? And again, at the end of the session in the waiting room, along with scales that measure empathy, helpfulness, and things like that. And that data guides the treatment. And patient therapists, when they see the scales and hear about them, say, oh, well, I don't want to use these scales because I don't believe my patients will be honest with me in the way they fill them out. And actually, the truth is the opposite. The problem is that the patients are honest in the way they fill out the scales. And when community therapists or even well-known academic therapists with big reputations use these scales for the first time, their patients give them, as I have mentioned, failing grades on every scale at every session with every patient. And this is crushing to the therapist's ego. And the question isn't, will the patients be honest? But the question is, can you, the therapist, take the heat and are willing to look at yourself for the first time? Usually the answer is no, that the therapists don't want this information. They can't tolerate it. They are unwilling to tolerate it. It's just too much for them. But about a third of therapists who attend my workshops and training programs say, yes, I do want this information. And then they use the feedback to develop vastly improved therapeutic skills. But there's a price to be paid for this kind of growth.
Yeah. David, would you mind if I played a little devil's advocate with you?
Yeah.
It's very interesting to me, but I don't know if there might be some cultural difference here also, because I am concerned in a way that sometimes clients could be wanting to almost defend their therapist. Imagine there is already a good relationship established, and they might feel that if they're honest with the patient, that something could go wrong. So they're not completely direct with the feedback. Is this something that has happened? What's your take on that?
Well, that's a wonderful development and easy to deal with, and can lead to therapeutic breakthroughs. The scales are so sensitive that patients like that will give a failing grade to the patient, and I'll explain why that is, and then I'll explain how to deal with that type of feedback, which is quite common because everyone is nice and nobody wants to hurt people's feelings. When when I developed my empathy scale, and I have a little 5-item empathy scale right now with things like, in today's session, my therapist was warm, sympathetic, and concerned. And then they put how much they agree with it from not at all true to very true, 0 to 3 type of thing, or 0, well, anyway, very true was the highest. And so it was relatively easy to get perfect scores on that scale, which was 15 out of 15, 5 people, very true in all categories. And then I thought, well, this isn't any good. We got to make it possible for the patient to fail the therapist. So I put a new category, a 4, completely true. And so what happens there is the patients can condemn you through faint praise. So they can give you a 3 on the scale, which is a hint. It's not as good as it should be. You might get like a 19 on that scale. All completely trues is a 20. And that's the lowest passing grade. And on this scale, a 19 and below is a failing grade. And it means on one or more of these measures, like trust and warmth and understanding, the patient is saying, you're not quite cutting it. It's not quite where I want to be. And the patients will give you, though initially therapists can't get 20s from any of their patients.
Okay.
So those patients are in fact failing you.
So they're not giving you a bad grade, but since they're not giving you the top grade, it's a sign.
That's it. That's exactly it. Okay. And it's kind of like if you eat in a restaurant that isn't very good, and then the wait person comes up and says, "Oh, how was it?" And what do you say?
Yeah, and I say, it was okay.
Yeah, it was fine. It was good.
Yeah.
They go away. And that's how it is in therapy. You say, how's the therapy going? The patient says, oh, it's going great. Are there any problems? Oh, no. You tell me, of course. Oh, yes. And it never comes out. But when they sit down with the assessment tools that I've developed, they will mark you down and they will write down comments. What did you like the least about the session? What did you like the best about the session? And you will get the information, and then you can process it with the patient, and that requires skill and training. Like I had a patient once who said to me, well, do you want an example?
Yeah, sure,
like
please.
A patient who didn't want to criticize me.
Yeah,
he was a young man with. Came to me with horrifically severe depression. He'd been treated by Philadelphia's top psychopharmacologist with aggressive, huge doses of multiple antidepressants with no improvement at all. And in addition, he lived alone with his mother, she was also horrifically depressed and had been most of her life, and he also had severe social phobia, so that whenever he was around an attractive woman, or whenever he was eating in public, he wouldn't eat in public or interact with attractive women because he was fearful that he would vomit on the women. He was so anxious, and he would never eat in public for the same reason. And he was a very good-looking guy. He was about 31. He was articulate. He was brilliant. He had a fabulous, let's say, high-tech career. He made good money. He was just a great guy, but he was, horrifically depressed and anxious and lonely. And he would come into my sessions, and I would give him homework assignments with the daily mood log and cognitive distortions and writing down his thoughts. And he was very good about doing the homework and was improving a lot. His depression was almost gone after, maybe 4 months. This was the early days before I had the high-speed methods we have today, but he was improving every week, and his anxiety went down, but he wouldn't date women, he wouldn't challenge his fears, he was kind of holding back. And on the feedback forms, he would always give me low empathy scores. Oh. And then I would say to him, can you tell me about that? It sounds like there were certain things during the session that turned you off or you didn't like, and he would change the subject, and he refused to deal with that. And so one day I said to him, we'll call him Michael, wasn't his real name. I said, but Michael, I know you're doing great homework, we're doing good therapy, but there's something missing in the empathy realm there, and you don't want to talk about it. And rather than asking you again, I'd like to ask you a different question, which is, if you were to criticize me, what do you think would happen? And this is called the downward arrow technique, or the interpersonal downward arrow technique, to get at some of the beliefs under the surface. And he said, well, if I criticized you, you'd get upset. You wouldn't like it. And I said, write that down on a piece of paper and put a downward arrow under it. And if that were true, why would that be upsetting to you? And what would that mean to you? What are you the most afraid of there? And he says, well, then you'd probably kick me out of therapy. And I said, well, write that down. I said, and then if that were true, what would that tell you about the kind of person I am, and the kind of relationship that we had? And he said, well, that I guess that would mean that you were very fragile and narcissistic. I said, okay, well, write that down. And I said, and how would you feel about this shrink who you pay, and he asks you to open up, and then you open up and he fires you, and he can't tolerate your real feelings? And he says, I don't think I'd like that guy much at all. And then I said, well, Michael, I can only imagine maybe this has been going on between the two of us. And I can imagine how painful this has been for you. And I said, we've been doing some great work together, but you haven't confronted your fears yet. And that's the one last piece. And when you do, it's going to be like jumping off a high diving board for the first time. And I won't have any 𝗔𝗹𝗃 for you. You're just going to have to jump, and when you hit the water, you'll find out the water's fine. And right now, Michael, you're at the end of that diving board, and the time has come for you to jump. I want you to change your life at this moment. And he got all nervous, and he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that you've come to sessions faithfully, you've done your homework, I appreciate that, I admire you, but you've never had the courage to be real with me and to tell me how you really feel. And the time has come to do that. Change your life at this moment. You're at the end of the diving board. It's time to jump. And he got very, very anxious. He didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. He was wringing his hands and staring up at the ceiling and very fidgety. And he finally looked up to me and he says, Dr. Burns, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And to tell you the truth, I had, more than 10 years of failed therapy before I came to you. I've taken every known antidepressant in the book, and nothing, and no one's been able to help me. And the tools you've developed are brilliant; they're fantastic. And the daily mood log, the cognitive distortions, all these 50 ways to change these distorted negative thoughts. And I'll be eternally grateful. You're the greatest shrink I've ever had by far. But I don't like you one bit. And I can't stand coming to sessions, and I dread coming to sessions, and I'm grateful when the session is over, and then I have to count the hours until the next session, and I just didn't want to say that to you for fear of hurting your feelings and ruining things for myself, and I was afraid of losing you. And I said to him, Michael, I hope what I'm saying doesn't sound phony or contrived, but to tell you the truth, I like you more now than ever before. In fact, I feel like I'm seeing you for the first time, and my hat's off to you. I have a tremendous respect for what you just said, and I can imagine how hard it's been for you and how anxiety-provoking and how angry you must feel inside and frustrated and just alone all the time in your life. And tell me more. I just want to hear everything that you have to say, all the things that you've been afraid to say. And he just opened up, and we had the most fantastic session. And at the end, I couldn't wait to see my empathy score. I got perfect score for the first time. But the interesting thing was that when he came back the next week, he had told me that where he worked, every lunch, these two attractive women would come by his office and say, "Do you want to join us for lunch today?" And he'd say, "Oh, no, I have to do an experiment in the lab." And he would, make some excuse. And he said the day after the session, they came, at lunch, as usual. And they said, "Michael, why don't you join us for lunch today?" And he said, "I told myself, here I am at the end of the diving board again. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's time to jump. How long am I going to wait for my first date? I'm 31 years old." And so he told the women, he says, "As a matter of fact, I don't have any experiments today, and I'd love to join you." Mm-hmm. And so they went down to a cafeteria around the corner, and he said, "Oddly, I didn't get sick to my stomach at all." And we started talking, and one of the women was very interested in movies, the one I was the most attracted to. And I told her, "Oh, I'm a movie buff. I rent movies all the time and watch all the classics." And then she said, "Well, Michael, do you ever go to a movie in a theater?" Uh-huh. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I do that too." And then she said, "Well, do you ever do that like on a date?" And he said, "Well, no, not too often, but that could be a good idea." And she said, "Well, tonight maybe?" And he said, "That's a great idea." So he went out on his first date with this young woman, and they went out to dinner. He didn't get sick to his stomach. They went to a movie, had a great time. He was dropping her off at her apartment around 10:30, and she said, "Well, Michael, it's kind of early. Maybe you'd want to come up and have some wine and listen to some music." Mm-hmm. He said, "That sounds like a great idea." So they went up and they started making out, his first, experience, this handsome, studly, charming guy with no experience. And all of a sudden it was 1:30 and they'd been making out like crazy. And then she said, "Well, Michael, maybe it's too late for you to go home. Maybe you'd want to just spend the night." And he said, "That sounds like a good idea." They ended up making love all night long, and he woke up in the morning madly in love, and she felt the same, and they'd been going out every night. And he handed me his scores on the depression test, the anxiety test, and they were, of course, 0. He was not only cured, he was in a euphoric state. And yeah, and he said, "It's this my last session. The thing we did last week was just blew my mind." And but I really felt like what happened was that when I pushed him, this was interpersonal exposure, and I had to trust him. He had to trust me to push that hard. But when he opened up and expressed his anger and his dislike for me, he suddenly discovered it was okay for him to have feelings. Yeah. And to express some negative feelings. And then I believe he was thinking, well, maybe sexuality is okay also. Yeah. And it's okay to have loving feelings and sexual feelings. But it was a fantastic thing. And he said, but his interpretation of what had happened was different from mine. And he said if he ever, mentioned him in a workshop or in a interview like what we have right now, that to tell people that about Birkenstock sandals. I don't know if you've ever heard of them.
I have no idea.
It's some kind of sandal that's very popular in the United States. And the day he had this date, they were doing this television campaign that how sexy you'll be if you wear these Birkenstock sandals. So he bought a pair before his date, and he was convinced that he got laid. So because of these sandals he was wearing. So he said, all your colleagues, therapists, if they're treating horny, lonely people to buy Birkenstock sandals, and he said it works like a charm, they'll get laid every time. So I promised him I would pass on the good news.
Okay, so now we can put that on the manual. Yeah. We can put the sandals on the manuals also.
Yeah, exactly. But it was the feedback forms and taking seriously that information and using that to deepen the relationship. But again, it was frightening for him. It was frightening for me. No one wants to hear that we're missing the mark with people. And yet, if willing to let your ego die, to have no self, then therapeutic breakthroughs are possible. And I've often said that almost all therapeutic breakthroughs come only through failure. And so the therapist must learn how to fail and be willing to fail if you'd like to get up to a world-class level in your therapy skills.
You know, David, what for me is amazing is that people could pin you down as a techniques guy, in a way, a tools guy. But the effective part of what you're saying seems to be almost like existential encounter-ish, in a way. Like you just promote this safe space, emotional...
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And there's more to it that we haven't talked about, and maybe for another interview, but about how to melt away the patient's resistance. But yes, you've got to have that trust, that deep connection with the patient if you want to do fantastic work. The tools are crucial.
Yeah.
Because if you were all good listening without the tools, the patient could think you're the best listener in the world and come and vent endlessly about their obsessive compulsive disorder, their troubled marriage, their severe depression, their social anxiety, and nothing would change.
Yeah.
But they think you were terrific, and this can turn into long-term therapy where nothing ever changes. The therapist loves it because the therapist likes to schmooze, and if it's a full fee patient, help stabilize your income. The patients love it because they come and talk and get support. But the patient never recovers. The patient's life never changes, at least not in any rapid way. And what we're trying to do is turn that around to where we can bring about dramatic changes, measurable, proven changes in patients very, very rapidly.
Yeah.
And that requires a kind of weird mixture of high technology combined with capacity for profound compassion and warmth, and to touch the person at the deepest level, and to be able to comprehend their suffering, and also to eliminate their natural resistance to change.
Yeah. David, we've already talked about so much of your contributions, and of course this important part of taking feedback, being emotionally available, eliciting all of this material.
Right.
It's already incredibly helpful, and I would like to end this conversation we had with one question that I've been asking all of our colleagues in these interviews. And that's very simply, and you've already touched, I guess, on a lot of what you would like to say, but still, what advice would you wish to have received when you were starting out as a therapist?
Well, I think I gave myself some advice that turned out very well, because I started out as a researcher in biological psychiatry, and we had to measure things. We had a research unit at the VA hospital in Philadelphia, and the depressed veterans would come and volunteer to be a part of research studies, and then they'd be, get their free hospitalization there for their depression. And we had to measure the depression levels of the patients every day. We use the old Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, which is a terrible scale from multiple perspectives. But the unpleasant thing about it, it's an interview that you give the patient that lasts about 20 minutes. You ask these questions to come up with a number from 0 to 70 or whatever it was, how depressed they are. And then we could publish papers in scientific journals about brain chemistry or treatments, that made it scientific. When I decided to leave biological psychiatry and develop my own private practice instead of staying on the faculty as a full-time brain researcher, I told myself, the one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure things like when I was a researcher, because that showed me what was really going on. And I said, every patient can be a research subject. And I started out with the old Beck Depression Inventory, and I didn't think it would work very well because I thought patients wouldn't give honest answers, kind of like the issue you raised earlier. But then I began to see it really was accurate, and they were giving me much better information than I had, from my clinical observations, just weren't very accurate, as it turned out. And so I use that to guide the treatment. Now we've developed much better scales that we use, much more sophisticated instruments. But I think that the use of science, data-driven therapy that we've developed now, the first full-blown data-driven form of psychotherapy, will move our field from competing cults, which I think the schools of psychotherapy function a little bit like cults or schools of religion, and people get very committed to CBT or DBT or EMDR or LSMFT or whatever. That was that old Lucky Strike means fine tobacco that they used to have. We get involved in some school of therapy and think that's the answer, and we're trying to move away. And I think you're probably very active in this movement as well. My research has been, how does psychotherapy work? What are the effective ingredients, and how can we put them together in a new science-based psychotherapy based on measurement and testing? And I think that the good money will drive out the bad money, the counterfeit money, and the day will come, I hope and believe, fairly soon, where assessment will be required of all therapists for a variety of reasons. Just like you couldn't have an emergency room if you didn't agree to use the X-ray machine, the blood tests, the thermometer, the EKG. We don't have tests that fancy in psychotherapy, but we do have extremely accurate brief scales now to measure the severity of depression at this moment, at the start of the session, at the end of the session. How warm and caring was the therapist? How helpful was the therapist? And I believe that's going to pave the way to the psychotherapies of the future. And I think the extreme high-speed treatments of the future already exists because this process has already started, and certainly we're seeing fantastic breakthroughs in the effectiveness of treatment in the new T.E.A.M CBT we've developed at Stanford. But I think measurement is going to be the cornerstone, the foundation of the psychotherapies of the future.
David, we've touched on a lot of important points, so I'd just like to finish off by thanking you for this opportunity to talk.
Well, I want to thank you too, and you're talking about the importance of the therapeutic relationship in therapy, but I think it's important, in all of life, really. That probably sounds like an old fart, which I am, but I really enjoyed you and interacting with you today. I appreciate your warmth and admire your mind, your questioning, your integrity, the really great questions you ask. My hat's off to you, and I hope to meet you in person someday, and if not that, maybe through this medium again.
I hope to one day be able to buy you a coffee so we can talk a lot more about measurement and the death of the ego.
And one last commercial plug, which I'm old enough to get away with it, is that if there are listeners who are interested in learning more about the new developments, there's tremendous free resources on my website, feelinggood.com. There's podcasts, there's written materials, new things for the general public, for patients on the one hand, and for therapists on the other. So if you want to learn more about some of these fun things we've been talking about, you might want to go to feelinggood.com, and there's tremendous resources there. There's weekly online training groups for therapists who want to learn these new techniques. There's my psychotherapy ebook called Tools, Not Schools of Therapy, Therapist Toolkit. There's a lot of good stuff there if people are hungry to look a bit more deeply into